Hey guys, so in this lecture, we're going to go over the entire semester in 30 minutes or so. I call it the TikTok version of the course. And so what we're going to focus on are some of the key takeaways from each section of the semester. So remember, the semester is divided into 3 parts, where we talk about conceptualizing concepts, how to measure them, move on to experiments, and then qualitative research at the end. Each one of those sections has a few key takeaways that are going to be important to internalize, go for you going forward, and of course, important for testing purposes. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So just before we get started, what the first question on the first exam is, what's the definition of marketing research? And when I'm feeling a bit more idealistic, I like to call it a quest for truth, because really what we're after is not marketing research that's being used to generate a statistic that we're going to put into an advertisement, but rather collecting data and processing it in a way that gives us insights in what the best way to proceed forward. So taking something that could have just been a debate and turning it into an empirical question that we can answer with data. So sometimes I see it as a quest for truth or a quest for clarity. Just that's what it, when you're really doing marketing research, that's what you're really doing. All right, so again, we have sort of 4 types of research that I like to think about. And they're sort of stacked up here in sort of a hierarchy where we go from sort of most fuzzy and nebulous down to the most precise. So we start off with conceptualization. So conceptualization is the situation where you really don't know what's going on, you don't even have a good sense of the area enough to formulate questions or scales and put them on a survey. Don't even have hypotheses about potential cause and effect relationships. In this kind of situation, what we're really doing is sort of more exploratory, oftentimes qualitative research. So this is what we'll get into in the last section of the semester when we do qualitative stuff. Moving up the hierarchy a little bit, we move into counting research. Counting research is what most marketing research actually ends up looking like. So counting research is deciding that we have a situation as a company that needs clarity, getting everybody, all the decision makers and stakeholders in a room, everybody starts throwing questions onto a giant survey. That survey goes out, we collect the data, then we get that back, and we decide what it is that we're trying to do with that data. That is a sort of a suboptimal approach. Everybody can already do it. On some level, we're going to learn how to measure things better, but in general, we try to sort of skip over just counting. Instead, we try to skip right over into the next level, which is correlations. So correlations is the idea that there are sort of cause and effect relationships, or sometimes it's called driver research. We have some outcome that we care about as a manager. Maybe it's satisfaction, maybe it's attitude towards our product, willingness to pay for the product, repeat purchase intentions, positive word of mouth, negative word of mouth, one of those sort of big managerial things that people care about. And we want to know what moves the needle on that. And so we have some ideas about some things that might cause that to happen. And so now what we're doing is we're sort of doing that counting approach, but we're going to do it in a much more focused way. We have some ideas about what might happen. Maybe we want to do a segmentation analysis where we have these certain psychographic and behavioral things that people do. We think will make them want to buy our product more. We're going to measure those things and look for some sort of correlations or implied cause and effect relationship. When it's causality does not equal correlation, as we know from class and all in the world. So when it's really important to nail down causation, and we have a really focused idea, now we're moving into this sort of causal research space. So causal research is inherently limited. So we really have maybe a version A and a version B. We know one of these should perform better than the other, hopefully, and we are going to test that to see if that's the case. So experiments or causal research tends out being much more focused. Often it's experimental in nature, and where you as the experiment provide the cause and look for some outcome. So I found that when you're involved with a marketing research project or you're doing some consulting, oftentimes it's useful just to go through this checklist and kind of make a mental note of where we are. And we always want to not settle on counting, because counting is just going to result in us getting a massive amount of data. And despite that massive amount of data, we're often surprised that we didn't actually collect the thing that we needed to collect. So we want to avoid that outcome. So instead, we sort of try to glaze over counting and move right into at least correlations, where we're thinking about ahead of time how the variables relate to one another. All right. So we essentially are dealing with only 4 types of data. So what we have here is nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio data. So this is a bit of an academic exercise, but it's pretty important actually to understand this. The reason being, the moral of the story here is what we want to do is we want to move our way from nominal data up through ordinal and interval and try to get to ratio. So ratio is the best data because it's the most precise, often has a meaningful 0 in there, which means we can take ratios and divide it by other things. And so we always try to move our way up there. So these names are exactly what they sound like. Nominal is data that has a name attached to it, but no inherent order. So sometimes an example that's used is gender or the state that you're from, sort of demographic type variables that have no inherent order necessarily to them, but have a name. Right? Then we move up to ordinal data. Ordinal data, the classic example of this will be a race finish, first, second, third. The problem with that is you don't know how much better the person that finished first actually did than the person that finished second. Maybe they really, crushed them. Maybe they just barely beat them. So with ordinal data has that inherent weakness. Where you see that most of the time in marketing research is asking people to rank something. So in general, we don't want to ask people to rank stuff. We want to ask them to rate things. So instead of saying rank these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, have the 5 things and ask them to rate them on a single item scale. Those single item scales are often in the format of what we call interval scale. Interval scale is the idea that there's an equal distance between the points. So most of our standard scales that we see, Likert scales where we go from strongly disagree to strongly agree, for example, are going to be this sort of interval format. Where we get into ratios, oftentimes in marketing research, we're asking people to fill in the blank with a number. So how many times on average, on an average week, do you eat fast food? Could be 0, right? Or it could be, 20 times. So that's going to be what we're after all the time is we know most things are normally distributed, and we want to do the best job of sort of representing this, sort of getting to this normally distributed data that really represents the range of possible values. So that's what we're ultimately after. And doing that in the most precise, accurate way that we can. So those are the 4 types of data. Again, the moral of the story is we always try to work our way up to ratio if we can get there. Typically, if something's not super concrete or countable, we have to back up a level to interval data, but rarely do we use the other 2. So one example might be, we talked about what state are you from as the nominal data. Well, maybe that's not what we really care about. Well, maybe we want to say like how many miles would you have to drive to get to this place, to this resort? And so instead of measuring it sort of imprecisely with state, we could just ask people to check Google Maps and how many minutes would it take you to get there? That might be a bit of a task, but it would be better data. So, all right, moving on. Next, 4-ish types of measures or scales. So we kind of talked about this just a second ago. We have open-ended scales. So these are great for concrete concepts that are countable. Then we have what's called semantic differential scales. Also, this is just what it sounds like. Semantics, words, different. What we have here is 2 different words on opposite sides of some series of points, usually 7 plus or minus 2. And people pick some continuum in between those polar opposites. Right? Also, we have a Likert scale. Likert scale is a very prescribed scale format. We have statements. So Likert scales are awesome. And then we would have strongly disagree, neither disagree nor agree, strongly agree. That's the 5-point version. For the 7-point version, we also slot some somewhat disagrees and somewhat agrees in there. But it's really the same format every time for Likert, statement with a capital and a period, and then these strongly disagree to strongly agree on 5 or 7 points. There are sometimes what I like to call a hybrid scale, and aren't really semantic differentials, but they're not really Likerts either. Usually this is when a concept has a lot of synonyms to it, but not a lot of antonyms. They're often used for emotional scales. So I feel happy, glad, excited, not good, really great fit. Some other things in that space, and we might say something like not at all, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, very much. Again, a 7-point scale, but going from 0 to 6 instead of 1 to 7. All right, that's what I like to call a hybrid scale. Also, there's another kind of scale that you see sometimes in psychology, and this actually comes up in class a fair amount, is what I like to call, sort of formative or additive summative scales. So those scales are a little bit different than the others. The first scale we talked about, open-ended, you're just counting something. So you're getting one number. It's usually a single item scale. The ones beneath it in the middle there, the semantic differentials, Likert, and hybrids are usually multi-item scales. So the idea behind a multi-item scale is that we're not really sure we can measure the concept that we're after with one item, so we maybe ask the same question essentially in a slightly different way. We would expect people to answer more or less the same, but we want to make sure that we get, cover the construct. We want to make sure we communicate to the participant what we're talking about. And so we've essentially take 3 or 4 cracks at it and then average those together. And that's the ones in the middle. The formative or additive scale is a little different. Usually those are, when you see them in practice, there are lots of different items. And what you do is you sort of add, but they might not be expected to correlate. So an example we use in class sometimes is this idea of Clemson family. So Clemson family is something we talk about a lot. And sometimes people come up with ways of measuring Clemson family, like I have lots of friends, I participate in clubs, I'm a member of Greek life, all these different activities that we think sort of would cause people to have this feeling. And then we add them up, I feel like part of Clemson, like they should all, maybe you have lots of friends, but you're not in a fraternity or sorority. So you wouldn't expect people to agree with both of those things. So the individual items aren't necessarily correlated in a formative or additive or summative scale. Instead, they sort of add up. Sometimes we see this in psychology. So a consumer behavior one is called maximizing. Maximizer formative scale might be something like, I change the radio station in the radio all the time until I find, a station that's perfect. I spend a lot of time in the grocery aisle picking out stuff because I'm never sure what's the right one. I really have trouble making decisions about buying optimal products. Maybe people don't change the station a lot in the radio because but maybe they have difficulty shopping and deciding on something or vice versa. But these all things are sort of tapped into the idea that people really focus a lot when they're making a consumer behavior type purchase decision. So anyway, that's the idea behind this summative scale. So they're a little bit different. I sort of have skewed away from talking about them in the past, but we seem to have this intuition for them, so it's best to be able to capture that intuition. All right, 3 steps for creating a measure. So the first one of those is don't. So go to marketingscaleshandbook.com, go to the Clemson Library website and type in Marketing Scales Handbook. Go to Amazon and spend $15 on most common scales marketers use book, and just use those scales. So people who are professional scale builders have spent a lot of time and effort and hours putting those scales together and publishing them and vetting them through various statistical methods. So use them. They're there, and cite them, ideally, if you're going to use them. But if you have a very unique concept that's not available in a published form, and you have to come up with your own scale, this is the process that I recommend. So first is name your concept. So actually write down the thing that you're trying to name, and then actually write down 2 or 3 sentences that describe that concept, that conceptualize it, that define it. Then lastly, for the last step, look back up to that name, look back to the conceptualizations, and translate them into the sentences and words that you see there into one of the 3 formats, the multi-item formats that we talked about. Ideally, if you're dealing with something more abstract. If you're dealing with something more concrete that's countable, maybe you can skip right to open-ended items. But if you're dealing with something that's a little more abstract and needs a little bit more thinking, and people may conceptualize in different ways, go through this step process. Name it, conceptualize it, use that conceptualization to then to build out items in one of the standard formats. All right. 5 common DVs and 1 place to look for more. So the managerial outcomes that we care about. So we talked about how, at least in the second part of the class, we're going to think of some outcome managers care about. We're going to think about things that move the needle on that. So I found that in class, sometimes people kind of forget to put this outcome in their surveys, and they're left with just a lot of measures of things, but not really the thing that they're after. So they forget to measure anticipated satisfaction, or they forget to measure willingness to pay or purchase intentions. Instead, they end up with a bunch of causes and no effect. So again, there's some standard ones: attitude, satisfaction, purchase intentions, willingness to pay, word of mouth, these kinds of things. Or there's lots of others in the marketing scale handbook. But for my students, just remember, like in all your surveys, make sure you have at least 1 or maybe 2 or 3 different outcomes that you're trying to manage towards, what sometimes people call your KPIs. All right, so here's where in class we might actually practice this. We practice it nearly every day in class, where we come up with a concept, conceptualize it, and flesh out a measure and present it on the board. So since we're doing this in sort of a lecture format, we're not going to do that here, but this is what that's all about. All right, 5 common research mistakes, or things that hurt my feelings. So these are going to be things that I specifically tell people or ask people or beg people not to do, because doing them decreases the quality of your research drastically. All right, so the first one on here is working backwards. So the idea behind working backwards is that we want to be as efficient as possible when doing marketing research. What often happens is that people engage in this kind of counting research, where they get around a table, they say, oh, wouldn't it be neat to know this? Wouldn't it be neat to know that? Wouldn't it be neat to know this? Oh, I wonder if this, oh, we should collect this, and this demographic variable. Oh, great, let's go. Let's spend $40,000 collecting the data. And then they come in and they're like, now what? So now we have to dig. We are sifting through what is almost essentially secondary data at that point and trying to craft a presentation out of it, trying to figure out what's going on. That's a bad way to do research. The better way to do research is to, what I like to call, work backwards. Talk to the team, talk to your decision makers, who are your clients if you're doing consulting, find out exactly what it is they're going to do with this data, right? And then find out what the graph would need to look like to provide them with the clarity they need to move forward. So then create the presentation. Say, okay, if we showed you these dozen or 15 graphs or infographics, whatever it was, like, would you know what to do? Would this satisfy your requirements? And they say, yes, that's great, you're good to go. If no, then you fill in more. And also, you can ask them, like, does this look about what, put some results in there and actually say, does this look about like what you think will happen? All right, so essentially what you're doing by that is you're sort of formulating some hypotheses and getting it down and figuring out actually what the analysis you need to look for is. Then after that point, once you have those graphs, you have the PowerPoints in place, you can back that into a survey. Once you have the survey that creates the data that you need for those charts or whatever, then you can set up your analysis in SPSS or whatever statistical package you're using. And then at the very end, you collect the data and just press go, and it sort of dominoes through to the end and you get your results. Maybe they match up with what you thought would happen, maybe not. But that's a much better way to do it, and it's usually not the way people do it, because it's just easier to jump in and start creating questions on Qualtrics. Don't do that. Jump in and start creating graphs first. Okay, that's the biggest mistake. Everybody does it all the time. Gets people in a lot of trouble. I try to tell people not to do it. They do it anyway. So don't do it. All right. So not measuring a hypothetical construct directly, but rather a proxy. So what this means is sometimes we like to measure things that are sort of conceptual. And we can do that with multi-item scales if we name the concept, put 2 to 3 words about the concept and then use that to build out a scale. But people who aren't trained at all don't have any basis, don't know how to sort of attack that problem. So instead what I see is that people end up measuring a proxy for something that is more concrete. So an example from this one time was a student was interested in, how people's sort of relationship with religion impacted how early they wanted to get married. And so she didn't know, wasn't quite sure how to get her head around a relationship with religion. So instead she says, well, I think people are more religious in the South in general, so I'm just gonna ask people what state they're from, which is like the worst way to do it, because first of all, you're like nominal data. First of all, you're not actually going after the thing you want directly. You're just sort of have this sort of very loose cause and effect relationship, and instead of measuring the outcome the thing you really care about, you're sort of measuring this easier to measure thing out front. So you see this where people often use country of origin as a proxy for, say, individualism versus collectivism. Don't do that. We have scales for individualism. We have scales for collectivism. We can come up with a scale for religiosity using a Likert scale, for example, probably would be a great start. Do that and go after the thing you're actually trying to measure rather than some more concrete, easy to measure demographic style proxy. Don't do that. All right. Forgetting to measure the DVs. So again, I have seen this before. We have a lot of independent variables and we don't have any sort of outcome to tie them into, or even start to look for correlations or relationships, or the extent to which some things are more important than others, because we haven't bothered to measure the outcomes we care about. So do that, and measure more than one. Some things I specifically recommend against: yes/no questions. That falls into that sort of, usually that nominal sort of space that doesn't accurately kind of generate this normally distributed data that we like to see. Ranking questions, hate those. Again, those are that ordinal kind of data. We can almost always do better. We can almost always move ourselves up to an interval related scale. Single item scales, people, we should just sort of, if we're going to measure something that's not concrete, we should just plan on having 3-item scale. Anytime we have something that's more conceptual, we're going to need to take 1 or 2 or 3 cracks at it, not just for us, but also for the participants, so they kind of understand where we're coming from. All right. And then multi-item measures with individual items that don't seem to be related. So if this is a concept that is really difficult for people to kind of get their heads around, like, why would I need to ask the same question multiple ways? Well, if something's nuanced and if different people have different things that come to mind when you're asking it, and you want to be precise and you want to measure the thing that you're interested in, you can't just do that with one item. If something's very straightforward, satisfied, dissatisfied, satisfied, you can get away with one item. But really, any like small distance past that, you want to have multi-item scales. So if you're measuring something, spend a minute and do some multi-item scales. Then you can average them together into a single score to use in your analysis, and you'll have a much better, more accurate data. All right. So again, work backwards. I say it all the time just because nobody does it. All right. I'm not kidding. So it will save you. Work backwards. Read the article. Article A in the reading. Read it. Believe it. All right. 2 types of experiments. We have between subjects experiments and within subjects experiments. You see a lot of different fluff when people are discussing, different taste test type experiments and this and that. But essentially it comes down to 2 flavors. Within subjects means everybody sees everything. So everybody is exposed to, let's say it's a taste test experiment. Everyone tastes cola A, B, C, and D. And in the other version, in between subjects, you might have a group that tastes A, a group that tastes B, a group that tastes C, and a group that tastes D. Okay? So why would you want one or the other? Our default, I think, for most people is this sort of within subjects where everybody sees everything and everybody tastes everything. The problem with that is that the weakness, let's say, but within subjects has a lot of nice features. One of these features is it's more powerful. And what more powerful is that it's more powerful because, so what that means is it's easier to get to that statistical significance we're after, that 0.05, that low p-value, with smaller, more subtle changes with the within subjects design. And the reason is that any sort of outlier aspects or weirdness or sort of strange sampling error or disproportionate samples that happen are spread out across all 4 groups in this case. Whereas maybe you get a bunch of people, if you're randomly putting people into one of 4 groups, you may get one of those groups really loves orange soda, for some reason, and like, or really hates orange soda, and they just happen to get assigned to the orange soda condition. So that can happen that can have a bigger effect in what are between subjects designs, where each individual condition of the experiment or level of the manipulation, however we want to talk about it, has its own unique group of people. Those people bring their own uniqueness that moves the needle, other than just the type of cola or drink or whatever moving the needle in this case. So that's a strength of within subjects. Between subjects, the strength of between subjects is that they're sneaky. Because I only see I only see orange soda, I may not know that I'm comparing orange soda, 5 different types of orange soda, or that I'm comparing orange soda versus cola versus this other type of beverage, whatever. So if you need to hide the purpose of the experiment, between subjects is really good because people are isolated in their own little pocket and they don't have a sense of what else is going on. With within subjects experiments, you sort of are showing all your cards. So sometimes that doesn't matter, and sometimes it does. So probably in the context of a taste test, might not be that important. But maybe there's something else. We talked, one example we have in class was maybe we create an ad. One of those ads has a dog in it. One of the ads, same exact ad, but it has a cat. All right. Once people look about that, if you show people both ads, they'll be like, oh, I see what's going on here. This is a study to see whether I like dogs or cats better in the ads. And so they're like, well, I see myself sort of a cat person, so I'm going to rate the cat one higher. Or, oh, I hate cats, I'm going to rate the dog one higher. Whereas that may have been a more extreme or a different way they would have reacted to it than if they had just looked at the ad and been like, oh yeah, I like that ad. They would have focused on the product maybe, instead of, oh, I see what's changed, this sort of subtle difference. So within subjects can cue people off to the hypothesis of the study, and when they know the hypothesis, they start to behave more differently. They start to react to the hypothesis rather than react to the stimuli more naturally sometimes. So just something to be aware of. So when secrecy is important, you err on the side of between. When power or the ability to detect subtle differences is important, you err on the side of within. All right. Okay. 3 styles of manipulation. So we talked about a scenario manipulation in class, where essentially you write a small story and just change a few of the words. We talked about maybe an image manipulation that might go along with that scenario, or just some sort of stimuli. And then we talked about bringing people into the physical lab space and actually doing something, some sort of taste test again, for example. All right. All right. So I know we're kind of, what are we kind of doing? We're going. Let's go. Let's keep going. All right. So one thing to avoid when designing experimental manipulations. So what we want to avoid is confounds. So a confound is a situation where we change more than one thing at a time. So the example I like to use in class sometimes is, say my garage door isn't working, and I read online that, oh, if you cover up the sensors, you shade the sensors, it'll go up and down because the sunlight interferes with the sensors. I also hear that, oh, you have to lubricate the wheels every once in a while or it won't work. So I go in and I lubricate the wheels and I cover up the sensors and I press the button and the garage door goes up. Great. Problem is, I don't know why. So do I have to keep spraying silicone on the wheels every so often, or was it the sensors that fixed it? I don't know, because I've changed more than 2 things. So if I introduce a confound into my experimental design, I lose the ability to say why something is happening. And it's often important to know why something happens, not just that it did. All right. 3 things to know about sampling. So when we're creating these groups, if they're between subjects design, for instance, how do we get these people? We want to use a sample size calculator. We want to think about how big our effect is going to be, and think about, okay, how many people will we need to get to statistical significance with such an effect? And when there's online calculators that you can use for that. Sort of a default from back in the old days might be like 40 per cell for a medium-sized effect, but any bigger that you could get would be great. But you could get started on an experiment with about 40-ish per group. Another thing is, don't pay for super specialized samples or demographically representative samples unless you have a really specific idea of why. And then if you do have a specific idea of why, a better idea is to just measure that thing. So you think, oh, well, I think, whether you're from coastal Carolina or upstate Carolina, impacts how much you want to eat oysters. Great. Okay, fine. Well, instead of making sure we spend tons of money getting exactly every single different mile away from the beach, maybe we just sort of measure that and throw that into the equation and see if it's actually how much of a difference that's making. All right. Two-ish types of data analysis that we're going to do in here. One, we're going to draw a line through dots. We're going to call that regression, or the general linear model. Essentially, we have some series of dots and we draw a line through them in order to fit the line to the dots in order to minimize the distance between the line and the dots. And that's the idea of regression, essentially. And then we have an equation that tells us, essentially all the equation does is describe that line to us. How fast is, for every 1 unit change in this x, how much does y go up? What's the slope? All right. Then we also do 95% confidence intervals around bars. So it's important to remember when we're looking at a bar chart, usually we tend to put too much faith in that bar. We tend to treat that bar like that is a great measure of that thing. And that's just what it is. But it's not really. What it is that we took some sample, maybe a random sample, 40 people, and we measured these 40 people, and they had some, and it was between subject designs, we had some outliers spread around, and their scores were bouncing around, but on average, it was about right here. So that bar is really just a guess. And it's a guess based on a subset of the people you actually want to talk about. So it's a sample that generates a mean, usually, that's the best guess for what's going to happen in the larger population. So they're just a guess. And so what we want to remember is that really the true value can be sort of anywhere in a particular zone around the top of that bar. And so what a 95% confidence interval is it draws that line in and gives us an idea of how much that bar could actually bounce up and down based on the data that we've looked at. So if the data that we've looked at is super consistent, then that bar is only going to be able to bounce that a little bit. If it turns out we keep seeing the data we're looking at is all over the place, well, maybe that bar still has a lot of bouncing it can do before it sort of settles out to the population mean. So a confidence interval is essentially just a way of saying like how good of an estimate is the top of that bar? How much can it still bounce around? Depending on the data we've had. Some other stuff, we're going to crosstabs and chi-squares, cluster analysis, conjoint. There'll be a section in the second section of the course. We'll spend a bit of time thinking about particular marketing or business questions and the particular statistics that we use to address those. But mostly in practice, we're just going to be doing linear regression and confidence intervals. All right. Two types of qualitative research. So we're into the last section of the course. So we have focus groups. Focus groups are extremely popular. I don't care for them. They do have one advantage though that I like to talk about, which is they can help you to bring in an outside group of people and get an outside perspective, because these people who are new to the product, who didn't build it, who don't think about it every day, see it in a different way. So they're able to sort of point out obvious flaws that you maybe don't see because you're such a product expert when you're the company. So that's a good use for a focus group. But focus groups tend to be overused, over-relied on. Like we wouldn't really do a survey of 15 people and say, oh, now we know what's going on. But people tend to do focus groups like of 15 people and I think they have it all figured out. So they tend to be overused and misused, and they have all slew of problems with them that we'll talk about later. But that's one type of research. The other type that I like to focus on more is in-depth one-on-one research. And the idea, it's a little bit more expensive. It costs, it requires a little bit more specialized training. But the idea behind this type of research is that we're getting really deep into someone's understanding of a concept. So deeper than they couldn't even fully articulate themselves without our help. At that point, we hopefully, as a company, can realize some value that we're providing to the consumer that they don't fully understand themselves and the competition doesn't understand either. And then we can position on that value proposition and then drive to competitive advantage. So this is the idea, really trying to understand somebody on a very deep level. And we can do this as a marketer, but we can also do this as, just a person talking to someone else, kind of listening to them, sort of an active listening, for lack of a better term, way of interacting with someone so that we really understand their perspective, give them a chance to articulate and explore their thoughts. All right. When we're doing that sort of qualitative research, there's really only two types of questions that we ask, which is why it's kind of an interesting way to talk to people. When we do this, we only do two things as the interviewer or the researcher. We either probe or we ladder. Probe means, oh, you said this interesting word, use this metaphor. I want to know more about that. Anytime the participant uses rich language, you say, oh, that was kind of a cool thing you said. Tell me more. You never assume that you know what they're talking about. So actually being a good interviewer is just being sort of sensitive to situations where people are using this kind of rich metaphor-laced language. Then once you hear that and you sort of ask them a couple times, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Tell me a little bit more. You feel like you've started beating a dead horse and you fully understand the space. And you say, okay, what's the outcome of that for you? What's the, if that's the independent variable, you wouldn't ask it this way, but if that's the independent variable, what's the dependent variable? What you would ask them is like, what's the outcome of that for you? Why is that important? What does that get you? What would happen if that wasn't there? It's called negative laddering. Moving people down this sort of chain to like something that is sort of a feature and benefit of a situation to something that's ultimately the psychological outcome. That's what you want to do with laddering. Probing is fully understanding them in the moment for how they see a particular concept. So one thing I like to say is at this point in the semester, we've sort of come back full circle to where we're conceptualizing a concept that's sort of abstract and thinking of multi-item measure to measure that concept. With probing, you're really doing the same thing, except now instead of thinking about how you understand a concept and how you would operationalize that concept or measure it, you're thinking about how someone else would. And you're trying to get them to think about it by saying, okay, you said that, what do you mean by that? Tell me okay, that's cool. When you were mentioning it, you use this metaphor. Tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that. Essentially, you're walking them through the conceptualization stage of measurement development when you're probing. After that, you ladder, which is essentially a correlation type analysis. You're talking about, okay, well, here are these causes. What is the outcome of that cause? So you're sort of transitioning into sort of a regression type linear thinking. Or as we talked about in experiments, sort of a mediating process, how we get from point A to B to C. All right. And that's it. So those are the big things we talk about in the semester, the sort of skills. And if you can sort of get those down and practice those and sort of make those part of your instincts when it comes to marketing research, you're going to be far, far ahead of most people. So there we go. Thanks very much. And we'll see you in class.